apparently it has come from the National Archives, and I was surprised to find that you were the one who catalogued the entire archives in 1970s or 80s. Now, what I'm asking you the question is, was there a policy of suppression? Because a lot of documents I couldn't find. In 1967, the government actually signed a treaty with Japan for some sort of war compensation, and I couldn't find that too. Even in the official publication, I had to trace it from the archives of the United Nations, which is available in the net anyway. Now, what question I would like to pose to you, is our government having a policy within the government or its national policy of actually suppressing some documents? But you were deeply involved in this, I believe. So.
Well, no, first of all, I was teaching in USM, and I felt that it was useful for the history students to actually handle documents. And at the same time, I was working in the archives. And I mean, that in itself was an interesting story, because I'd had permission to go into the archives when I was doing my PhD research. So that means 73, 74. I came back and started teaching in USM in 1977. And so I went to the archives and I said, okay, I'm back in Malaysia. Will I be able to use the archives? And somebody there said, are you doing the same topic that you did for your PhD? I started to say no, and he said, the correct answer is yes, because if you're still doing the same topic, we can simply renew your permission. So I continued my PhD research for another 10 years. Okay, in the course of that, I was going through a lot of the lists of documents. In those days, you went there, you had dockets, which were just lists, sequential lists of the documents in different file series, High Commissioner's Office, and so on. And I was just writing down titles and the file numbers for my own use. And then I thought, well, if I want students to go in there, they are not going to have time to go through all these long, long lists. So I took my lists and I reproduced them. And I discovered that you could generate indexes through a computer. And this is back in the days where it was something that you would do in about 10 seconds. You might start it running on a mainframe and come back 2 hours later and see if it's done. But we generated these indexes. I wasn't responsible for organizing the archives. What I was doing was putting together lists of what seemed to me the most significant files and making those lists available to students so they could go down to the archives and access documents. Okay, now, to address your question. And let me preface this by saying I don't have any inside knowledge about what goes on in the archives. What I do know is that over the years, a lot of things that you would expect to turn up haven't. But I'm not sure whether you want to blame this on some systematic suppression or whether it's simply inefficiency. And I suspect any archive that there is some systematic, okay, we're not going to show this, not going to show that. But documents that, to my mind, there's no reason why anyone's going to object to them, and they should be around and they're not. Let me just take something very simple. Before the war, you had documents in the state secretariats of every state in the peninsula. And what happens at the end of the occupation is that the Japanese are very concerned that people are going to see things relating to the wartime administration that they don't want to come out. And part of the surrender agreement is that they're not supposed to destroy documents. They're supposed to maintain the record of what happened during the war. But what happens instead is that the Kempeitai sends working parties into these state secretariats. They can't read English, so they just haul out everything they can find and burn it. The Selangor Secretariat is the major resource that's left, and the reason it survived was that it had been relocated to another place, and these Kempeitai working parties didn't find those documents. What I relied on when I was doing the research was district office files, forest department, And the reason these survived was they were not in the central location. They were in outlying offices. And even there, the survival rate is very small. You may find 20% of what should be there has survived. Okay, but after the war, there's no more Kempeitai Working Party going in there and destroying the documents. So there should be secretariat files for every state. And those are not there. So, where are they? Okay, I went to Perak. And I was talking to a clerk in Perak. He's long retired, but he for all the time he was there, he said, don't ever tell people about this. But what happened was that I went to Perak, and behind the Secretariat building, there was a Quonset hut. And people went out there and ate their lunch, sitting on top of the post-war Penang Secretariat. All the files on the floor, so deep, I don't know how deep. The top ones were being damaged because people ate their lunch and their crumbs would drop, and then the rats would come and eat the crumbs. The bottom, there was water seeping up and getting into the papers from the bottom. But this whole building covered with files. Why were they still there? Well, there'd been a problem with the archives. What had happened was that files were transferred. And then the government department in question would say, oh, we need this document back. And the archives would check, and they would say, well, you didn't give it to us. And the government department would say, yes, we did. And so there was a big fight. So the archives started saying, before documents are sent, the government department sending them has to list them. They have to send us a list of what we're getting. Then we won't have these arguments. And this poor clerk sitting there in Ipoh said, I don't have any way to list these documents. I'm one person, I'm overworked, I have no manpower. Eventually, we talked to the head of the archives. She said, oh my goodness, those papers are there. We have to have them. But by that time, the Religious Affairs Department had occupied that building. Files had been stuffed into goodies and moved up, God knows where. Some got moved down. I think some of them never made it. What happened to the other secretaries, I have no idea. I can't find them. So you're right, there's something wrong. But I don't know that it's anything like, yes, we picked out this document.
It's more than that they published, pricey they were, but I could not able to get cooperation to access those books in USM library. So is there a policy that others should not see? Or do they even have a set of your books there? It looks like I may have to travel down to the National University of Singapore to look at it. I don't think Malaya University has a set of your books, although it's directly relevant.
Well, you have to talk to Routledge because it says, and I don't get anything out of them. Why people like me put in time and effort and then Routledge makes all the money is totally beyond me, but we keep doing it. Well, let me just tell you something about the Andaman Islands, though. Because one of the most extraordinary stories I came across, there were laborers from Java who were sent during the war to the Nicobar and Andaman Islands. So when the war ended, they were still there. They wanted to go back to Java. And it took time to get something organized. But finally the Dutch come along and they say, we will send a ship and we'll take you back. But by this time the Indonesian Revolution is underway. And these Javanese in the Andamans and Nicobar say, we think we can't trust the Dutch. We think we will get on this Dutch ship, they will take us out to sea and throw us overboard. We'll never make it home. So we want somebody else to send a ship. Well, nobody else was going to send a ship, and the Dutch say, this is your only chance to go back. So you take it or leave it. They left it. They're still there, except for the ones that got washed off during the hurricanes. But those Javanese laborers never made it home.
Yeah.
Very pleasant evening. My name is Enzo. I'm a student from Penang. I just want to ask you that why the Japanese wanted to pull the Americans into the war? As we know, without the Americans on the Allied powers, the course of history would be totally different. To your knowledge, why is it?
It's a school of thought that believed that the Japanese would simply bypass the Philippines. And they would come through Southeast Asia because they had to have the oil. And what was going on before the war was that the Americans, among others, were trying to shape Japanese foreign policy by using the Japanese demand for oil. And so they were cutting them off from supplies of oil as a way to try to suppress the sort of ultranationalism that was found in Japan. And it turned out to be a very bad idea because from the Japanese point of view, they looked at their supplies of oil, petroleum products, and as of, say, 1941, they had enough to fight. But if they didn't get additional supplies, the stockpiles they had were going to go down. So if they waited a year or so, they would no longer have the capacity to fight. So their choice was either we fight now, or we're not going to be able to do it in the future. And I mean, it could have gone either way, but given the sort of people that were in charge, they decided that they had to go to war. Okay, so then the second question is, why would they do something to draw in the United States? Rather than say, okay, we'll leave the Philippines alone. We'll come into Southeast Asia, because part of their concern was supplies reaching China through Southeast Asia. Well, the Philippines has nothing much to do with that. I think the calculation had to be that if they came in and attacked the British in Malaya, the Americans were likely to get involved. It's not absolutely certain, though, because there was a strong anti-war feeling. This is the Europeans, they're fighting another war, it's nothing to do with us. And the Europeans have these colonies in Southeast Asia. Well, we're already giving up the Philippines. I mean, by the 1930s, they had committed to giving the Philippines independence. So you could imagine a scenario where the United States does not get involved. But obviously the Japanese calculation was they would get involved. So rather than allow them to come in at full strength, you attack Pearl Harbor, and you attack the Philippines, and you weaken the United States to the point that you have a chance to build a foundation and ideally keep the United States ever from coming in. I mean, you have to look at this from the standpoint of 1940. You're looking at it now, you know what happened. You're saying, well, the United States got involved and that was decisive. But if you put yourself in 1940, and you try to calculate this as the Japanese might have done, they could envision a situation where they weaken the U.S., they establish a very strong co-prosperity sphere. Okay, what's the U.S. going to do? Are they going to rebuild their strength and attack? Well, they did, actually, but you can imagine a scenario where they don't. They just say, okay, this is not our war, we're staying out.
Okay. Yes. Stephen again?
And yes, it was a very nice lecture. Now, I just want to ask, you learned a lot about the Japanese occupation in Penang, and is it true that it's occupied by the Japanese naval force vis-a-vis the Japanese Imperial Army in the rest of Malaya, and that Penang has got it off lightly because I think the naval forces, they are more gentlemanly. So could you comment on that? I'm not sure. And of course, the second thing is, do you did any study on the monsoon, the German monsoon fleet in Penang?
So the second
the German monsoon fleet in Penang, the submarine fleet. Yeah.
I've pictures. I mean, one of the things when they were picking up fishermen at sea, they wanted to find out about the German presence, so there was interest in that. But beyond that, I don't know. The question about the Navy. I really don't know enough to talk about the general thing, though, that happens, if you look across Southeast Asia, is that the Chinese population in Malaya and Singapore was very brutally treated compared to the population in Java, for example. Well, the key thing here is that a lot of the Chinese here were first generation. They were basically people from China who had come down, whereas the Peranakan populations were much less deeply involved with Chinese politics and much less concerned with what the Japanese might be doing in China. And so the Japanese policies or behavior toward Chinese populations is calibrated partly on the basis of how they anticipate that population is going to react to them. There is the story, the feeling that the Navy, yes, maybe more gentlemanly, or that they were certainly less brutal. But the Army, I mean, we in U.S. press published a book which was looking at the diaries of some of the Japanese soldiers who come down through the Malay Peninsula. And you get all these stories about how they are hardened, battle-hardened veterans and people who are really brutal. And you read these diaries. They were a bunch of young kids who've been brought into the army, and they come down into Southeast Asia. Wow, coconut tree. Wow, pretty girls. Wow, this is really interesting. Or they have a girlfriend at home, and they're writing about all this. And I mean, it's just like any army. It's full of young kids who get thrown into very brutal situations. But yes, they had experience. They did their job. But this isn't answering your question, I'm afraid.
Maybe I can add. If you're saying the Imperial Japanese Army or the Imperial Japanese Navy, which is more hard, in Borneo, the Imperial Japanese Navy in Kalimantan were very nasty because of policy. For the Japanese, Borneo is supposed to be, for the Navy areas, is permanent possession. So for the Japanese, they don't intend to leave. By the Army area, it's just to grab whatever resources and try to get full cooperation to a certain extent. Of course, just like what Paul said, in most areas they will have the first reign of terror. But one must understand with Malaya and Singapore, the huge Chinese population. So they use preemptive action against this potential threat. So the Chinese population had to be silenced as far as possible, because if there's going to be a backlash, the most organized among all the ethnic groups in Malaya and Singapore at that time were the Chinese. So when they had the Suk Jing campaign, anybody who is involved with the triads, or what the British call the so-called secret societies, so anybody who has a tattoo, because it's part of the Chinese initiation rites into this secret society, they will eliminate them. Because these are the people who are going to be potential, which to a certain extent, the Japanese were right. Because most of these people went into the jungle and joined the Malayan Communist Party, or at that time, they started the anti-AJA. So it's because of that reaction. So for Borneo, the Navy, especially the Kalimantan side, the Navy was very, very tough, and they massacred a lot of Chinese in Pontianak and also in Banjarmasin. It's because, not so much because of opposition, but more of trying to establish a new regime. They didn't want anybody who has connection with the past, so to eliminate to a certain extent. I mean, that is my argument. Maybe some others might see it differently. Because the fact that they eliminate a lot of school teachers, captains of industry, all the elite in the pre-war regime, they wanted to have a new Kalimantan or new Borneo. So in that sense, the Navy who is running the show, the secret police is even worse than the Kempetai. So, but that is under different circumstances. So whether Penang had it better off or what, I mean, maybe, well, you are more fortunate or what, but we don't know. Any more questions? Ah, yes.
Penang, orang biasa. I have occasions from time to time to go to a small market in Penang, which is predominantly Chinese and very, very crowded. Actually, it's in Jalan Kuala Kangsar, just off the Campbell. And I've always, while my wife is doing the marketing, I take the opportunity to stroll around, observe the scene. It has struck me how many of the older generation are stunted and still have that malnourished look. So my question is to do with what you were saying about the malnourishment. I wonder if it's possible that this trait is still in evidence in the older population, or whether it has already been leached out. Thank you.
I've wondered the same thing, especially when I walk around the NUS campus and I find young Chinese boys who are as tall as I am. I think there is certainly, you look at that generation, and I think it certainly affected them. I mean, whether there's more going on, it's certainly genetics, something like that will come into play. But I think it did, did affect a great many people in the peninsula. But their formative years, they simply didn't have adequate diets. So yes, I think you're absolutely right.
Yes, Professor Evers.
If you compare the administration of the Japanese in Java and in Malaya, the impact on Java was quite substantial. In fact, the present Indonesian system of administration was built during the Japanese times, from Tanga up to Katamana and Kabupaten. But this apparently did not happen in Malaya. Why is that the case? Were they less effective, or were the British more effective of changing everything back? So what happened on the civil administration side?
The essential thing they need to do is to keep things orderly, because their troops are going to come through and they're going to go on. And so the civil servants are told you must go back to work. The expectation was, as time passed, that there would be some adjustment in the system. And there were some adjustments. There are a few offices in the Secretariat that are added that weren't there before. But they don't substantially revise things. And I'm not entirely sure why that is, but you're right, it doesn't happen here. The structures that are found before the war pretty much survive intact. And it may well be simply that the system was effective and there's no need to change it in the short term, and they didn't really have the opportunity to stay in the long term. I'm not sure what they would have done, but I don't see much sign that anything much happened.
I suppose, Hans, I think probably is the Indonesians prefer the Japanese than Dutch, probably.
My name is Leslie James. I'm from Canada. The first time I came to Malaysia was in the late 1960s, and I remember Singapore building the monument just not far from the Raffles Hotel, the monument to the civilian victims of the Japanese occupation. And in those years, the late 60s, there was quite a bit of discussion, the Singapore government and the Malaysian government with Japan over the issue of compensation. There was, I think there was the Japanese came up with the idea of a ship that would bring young Japanese to work as volunteers. I don't remember whatever came of that idea. Getting back to your own discussion, I found it very interesting indeed. And what interests me primarily in all of this discussion is perceptions. Perceptions of a period some 65 to 70 years ago. And although, as I mentioned, it was quite an active political issue in the late 60s, it seems to have died away. And it's really quite interesting, although you've been studying the subject for quite a number of years, it's really quite interesting and even odd that we're only now having this kind of discussion about the perception of this extraordinary period in the history of Southeast Asia. Has there been, I wonder what your view is, having worked and studied and researched this issue over quite a number of years. Did you detect some kind of reluctance to air a discussion like this in this country earlier in public? Has there been a reluctance? Have people wanted to suppress this period from their memories? I mean, there are other parts of the world that went through occupations, and France today is still not come to terms with the occupation. Whether one was in the resistance, whether one collaborated, is all very much just below the surface in French politics. I'd be interested in your views on are we now only now beginning to look at this period publicly? Is that your perception as well? Thank you.
I think in a way, I've had any number of young people in Singapore tell me I'm studying Japanese. My grandmother hates the idea, or I can't tell my grandmother. But I like studying Japanese. I want to go to Japan. So in some respects, it's certainly less of a visceral issue than it used to be. And I think for many years, the general perception was simply that we don't know anything about it. There's no evidence. So how are we going to do anything? How are we going to study this? And there was a bit of a wave. What happened in the middle of the 1990s? The Japanese, the Toyota Foundation, put money into several research projects, one in the Philippines, one in Indonesia, one in Malaysia. And these were oriented toward collecting whatever survived of documentation and also oral accounts and so on of the occupation period. And another project was eventually conceived and partly carried out for Burma. Quite a lot of documentation was published in Japanese. NUS Press has done a book which came out of that research, which is the same researchers putting together some of their findings in English. But I think there was this feeling that, well, it's just a lost cause trying to study this. And that accounts for part of what happened. So far as a reluctance, you see, the question that is constantly coming up in Malaysia, or was at the time, was how were the Malays treated? In the sense that the Malays had a much easier time of it than anybody else. So we don't want to talk about that. In Singapore, the official position has always been everybody suffered equally. We don't want to just differentiate between one group and another. But the problem on both sides is that Japan emerged as a major economic